Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's Wired for Growth podcast. I have a very special guest with us today, Ryan Bricker. He's a director of Rise Athletic Development here in Warsaw, Indiana, high school basketball coach, and my barber for a number of years. How many years total did you do that?
20 years.
20 years total.
In Winona Lake.
And folks, I just want to let you know that while we're going to deep dive into some sports-related topics today, the idea is a lot of these themes and values really apply to being a parent, apply to being a leader or general business place. So as you listen today, try to have an open mind on how we can take some of these values and themes and really apply it in your own life. Ryan, would you mind kicking us off with a quick bio?
Sure. Ryan Bricker, and I'm lucky to be married to Jessica Bricker. Some people in the community would know her. I have 3 children, Lucas, who's 17, Jocelyn's 15, and Aubrey's 13, and I just can't believe we're that far down the road in our parenting, but real great blessing to have those 3 kids, and certainly blessed to have Jessica in my life. So I'm from Albion, Indiana.
Okay.
Those that might be local, about 2 miles north of Chain Lake State Park is where I grew up. Great place to grow up, out in the country there, small community, had a wonderful childhood, but all of that in athletics, and even at Central Noble High School there, learned so much, was invested in by so many people, and because of their investment, I'm still involved in athletics to this day.
Talk to me a little bit about basketball in particular, what that means to you. When did you get started? What's some early memories you have?
Yeah. The earliest memory I have is those Nerf suction cupped basketball hoops, that they came out with in the about 82, maybe something like that. Maybe it was a little earlier, but I had one of those, and it was on my mom's refrigerator in her kitchen, and I just loved to watch that ball go through that hoop.
Oh yeah.
And that's what I did all of the time. And as I grew up, continued on in basketball, playing at Central Noble High School ultimately, and then Grace College and University of St. Francis. Had a really great experience. It wasn't always easy. In fact, it was filled with a lot of ups and downs and disappointments, but a lot of great things as well, great memories, great people. And I just look at how God gave me a love for a ball going through the hoop, and then, all those years later used it to take me to a place where I hope that I can have an impact on people still through the game today.
Growing up, you very into sports. Tell me a little bit about the role your parents played in that. How did they support you in this? And every parent is a parent for the first time and learns how to do this, but. Yeah,
great parents. My dad is in law enforcement all his life, all his working life. He was an Indiana State Police trooper. He was a detective. He was a warden of the Noble County Jail. So his background, in law enforcement. My mom was a human resource manager for a couple businesses in the Noble County area. My parents were incredibly supportive, and I look back now, having my own children, realize what my parents were actually doing for me at the time and how big a deal that really was. Took it for granted then, of course, like probably most kids do. But just so thankful. Back then it was interesting time. Sports were evolving, and the travel club world was evolving, but it was the very front end of that. And so my parents were participating in getting me to and from things, but they weren't really overly involved in my sports life. And honestly, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
There was a lot of freedom then to be coached and to enjoy the experience without any worry of what my parents might be thinking. So they were really good about allowing my coaches to coach me, and they didn't over participate in that, right? They had lives that they were living too, and that they didn't need, I guess, my sports experience to be so great in their life as well.
Sure.
So that was a beneficial thing for me. So I think that's changed a lot now.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get into that some.
Yeah, we will.
But I was really fortunate to grow up with a lot of support just from my parents and then other family members,
Talk to me about Rise, and love to hear about the mission and what your vision is in the future for Rise.
Did not start Rise Athletic Development intentionally, or didn't have a strong belief that that's what I was going to do when I, graduated from college or anything like that. I just, my experience in basketball was, like I said earlier, very up and down, and I think that's sports in general. What I realized early, or actually later in my college career, was my identity was completely wrapped up in sports. I saw myself as a basketball player. Everything I did was related to being a basketball player. And in some ways that helped me grow in the game of basketball, but it also gave me a false sense in some ways of who I was, because the ball will stop bouncing for everyone. And so you start to ask the questions, who am I when this isn't a part of my life anymore? And so there's an identity sort of, crisis, if you will, there that I had to kind of work through. I sort of vowed to myself to do the best I could with my own children to not make basketball a god in their life, or make their life centered around that so much that that's just how they view themselves. Have I been good at that? Maybe sometimes I'm good at it. Maybe sometimes I'm not. But that was the intention. And even through Rise, that's sort of one of the main things I really try to get at is, who are you really, regardless of what this ball does for you? And so
what age did you start that conversation?
I don't hesitate to start it too early, frankly. I wish others had started maybe a little earlier with me. And so certainly when they're really young, it's just about having fun and keeping the interest in the game, but also pointing them to the reasons why we play. To honor God with our gifts. And so I feel like, by the time a kid gets to about 6th or 7th grade, you're starting to get into the teenage years almost. And so the way they view themselves and their awareness about how people view them really starts to pick up. And that's when you start to have the conversations that I think are a little bit more meaningful in regards to their identity and who they are. And so I'd say 6th graders, for some, is kind of where it starts, but certainly middle school and then in high school. I have a real heart for the high school age group, just because there is a lot of pressure. There is a lot of requirement on their time. There are physical demands and mental demands. And so I want to help them have clarity in what that really is supposed to be, versus them getting sucked into this vortex and then it just gets all spun and confused. And then when crisis happens, I'm not getting playing time. I do get injured. We lose. How do you handle that? And so my heart is really ultimately for those kids who are playing at a competitive level, but have to work through that at some point.
Wow. Unbelievable stuff. Now, what would you say, hey, looking back, Rise will be successful if you're able to really impact those kids and understanding, hey, don't get your identity from sports. It's too volatile. It's up and down.
It's a great question. I think as I look at it now and I cast vision for the future, and I think any coach would tell you this, you don't really know the impact you're having, probably. I mean, probably in some ways we mute it and we don't think we're having that much impact. The reality is we really, truly are, for good or bad.
Right.
And so some of that will get hashed out over time. Some of that I'll find out in heaven, Lord willing, right? What impact there truly was. But I hope that, I can point kids to Christ through the game. And ultimately, if kids come to the saving knowledge of Christ through what we do with Rise, then those are obvious wins. But I want to see ultimately those young girls, those young men, because of what they experienced through Rise and other venues as well, lead their families to the Lord and live God-honoring lives in that way. And if we can just be a small part of that, great. We don't need to be the main menu in that. We just, if we can be a small part of that, I think that's important. So we want to have impact on people's lives and influence over that if we can,
So one of the bigger topics I wanted to get into with you today, we'll just dive right in, and it's actually parents and their role in all this. And I'm sure you've seen the whole spectrum, right? I'm sure you've seen the, I'm going to open up the van door and the kid's going to get out, and that's my role. And I'm sure you've seen parents in the bleachers yelling profanities and whatnot. I've been to a couple games, and I think our town does an okay job, but there's a broad spectrum, isn't there?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
What are some of the ways that a parent can really help sports be a healthy, positive contributor to their kids?
Yeah.
What's their role?
It's a great question. You can't give away what you don't possess, right? And so ultimately, even me at 43 and my wife, we're still having to grow in our character, right? And it's hard to not have a vision for your kids,
Sure.
right? And it's hard to look around you and see what others are doing, especially in today's world. We know what everyone's doing.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
You can find out every neighbor you've got what they've done in the last 3 days.
How many travel leagues they're enrolled in and where they're at. Yeah.
And immediately when you see that stuff, you feel like, am I doing enough?
Yeah.
Am I giving them the best opportunity? Right. And so I think parents oftentimes live in fear. And that's not a good place to live ultimately. And so the comparison game is probably as deep as it's ever been.
Yeah.
And I think what we have to do as parents is take a step back from comparing and run your own race, right?
Yeah.
And realize, and I don't think we're good at this, realize that the race you're running is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And we're terrible at that because we're very impatient, right? And I think if we can cast a vision for the long term, what do I want, not my own, what do I want my grandkids to be like? Because through my kids, I'm going to have influence on what my grandkids might be like, right? So casting a really long vision. But then at the same time, having good habits, right? And demonstrating that very openly with your kids. And you can decide what you want your habits to be, but they're going to pick up on that. And so the role of parents is honestly probably a little less talk and a lot more action, if you will, right? And so your kids are going to pick up on your habits and who you are and the essence of who you are. And as parents, man, if you don't have a disciplined life, if you don't have good habits, if you're not humble, if you're not teachable yourself, if you're not reading and you're not learning, your kids aren't going to be like that.
Yeah. What are some of the signs that you see maybe earlier on that a parent is potentially not on that good path?
Yeah, I think there's, a lot of danger in, again, the comparison side, right? So if you're telling me all that you're doing, that's probably, to me, honestly, a red flag, right?
Okay.
We're doing this, we're going here, we're traveling this, we're playing this tournament. Honestly, and I say this somewhat for shock value, but if I can say it this way, I'll say it, no one cares.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And that's not to be mean or mean-spirited, but the reality is we spend a lot of time trying to get people who really don't care liking us because of what we're doing or looking at us because of what we're doing. And so I think, the comparison side is one thing. I think, you hear about kids or parents living through their children's lives, right? Their sports lives. Those are red flags too. I think over-involvement is a thing, right? Where parents are just so overly involved in what their kids are doing. It doesn't mean you're not involved. But there's over-involvement here, hyper-focus on things that ultimately don't matter. So many of the kids who ultimately make it in high school athletics, they probably aren't the kids that you would pick in sixth grade. There will be some, right? But the majority of them are going to have a growth mindset of some kind, right? They're going to have a long-term view. Their character's going to be really high, at least we hope, right? And so many kids who run that sprint early on and then realize it's a marathon, they fall off. And it's the same with the parents, right? Is that you're just overcooking this so early.
Probably some forced desire and lack of authenticity in those situations too, right? I mean, you fall out of love with the game and I suppose some of these folks, the love is never there, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you see that in a lot of kids where it's like they just don't love doing this, but their parents are making them do it, right? So, there are a lot of ways to be involved in athletics, right? I think, and I love basketball. But some of the best sports don't have a ball involved. Cross country, swimming, right? Objective data, self-improvement. I'm on a team, but I'm also just really kind of thinking through how do I get better in this, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot less subjectivity in those sports. So those are great sports to be involved into, and I think people miss those sports sometimes because they're not as public.
Not as flashy.
Yeah. And so help your kids find where they're gifted and what they're passionate about, and try really hard not to push your passions on your children.
Just asking your opinion on
related
this.
to sports.
Yeah, sure. When you see a parent really live vicariously through their younger kids in sports, and it's just an opinion I'm asking, but what's usually behind that? What's kind of rooted in that? I tend to see that a lot.
Yeah, it's identity, right? Again, I think a lot of things go back to identity, but how that parent sees themselves. Do I need validation somehow through what my kid is doing? Or am I just totally fine with my life as it is, right? And the pursuits that I have within my family or pursuits that I have in work. So I do think there's an identity crisis happening broadly, and I think parents are definitely feeling that. And I think when you have an identity crisis like that, the domino effect of how that plays out in your life, it's going to hurt relationships. And so I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of ways. I think that's where the parental child relationship can start to crumble when the parent identity is so vastly affected by outcomes on a court.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Ryan, what are some of the things that you see early on in players? You mentioned one or two already that go on to be, when I say successful in sports, I really mean it was a win-win situation for them. It doesn't mean that they won state championship, but maybe had a great experience, learned a lot, improved, bettered their lives. What are you seeing early on in people that actually track that way?
Yeah, I think there's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and it's grit, right? It's that ability to toil with something that isn't easy.
Sure.
And I think that is something that if you have a child who is willing to toil with something that they find difficult but are kind of passionate about, man, that you pay attention to that. That could be a really good thing in their life, right? And something that can really help them blossom. So grit would be one thing. Another thing I think that comes out is just that the way a kid thinks. So, and by that I mean, do they look at a challenge and shrink from it, or they look at a challenge and think, I'm curious if I can do that or not. And those kids who are willing to do what feels scary, doesn't mean that they may pass on it the first time, but when they revisit, like, okay, I'm gonna try it. Yeah, boy, those are two things that we really see in athletes who are successful, and not every kid has that early.
So that was leading my next question, which is not only kids, but people in general. Do you think curiosity and grit are coachable characteristics and attributes?
Yeah, for some, certainly it comes more naturally, right? There are people who are more risk-oriented and thrive in an environment like that. I do. I do think those things can be taught. And probably, honestly, they're taught through experiences, right? So you can tell a kid, hey, go for it, right? But if you never really provide the experiences for that kid to actually fall down, get back up, fall down, get back up, they're never really going to learn that. So that's the beauty of, I think, youth sports, especially when kids are young, is you can provide multiple avenues, multiple sports for them to grow in their experiences, right? And be exposed to challenges. Yeah. And 100%, I believe a kid can grow in that area. Sure. Probably by about the time they're 17 or 18, now so they're almost out of high school at that point. Yeah. But that's when you start to see a shift in mindset a little bit. Okay, I can do that. They're maturing physically. Their brains are still growing, right? And so that's when you oftentimes see a big jump, the jump you've been waiting for. Yeah, sure. Right? It may not always look like you want it to, but it's then if it's at 13 or 14 and they have that jump, they probably have a chance to be really good. Yeah. But most kids are not going to have it at that age.
Well, and I feel like parents want that jump to be made from 7 to 8. Yeah. or 8 to 9, and it's like, man, no, it takes some time.
Michael, I've been guilty of that with my own kids. Sure, I mean, I've watched them struggle and thought, oh man, I don't know if they'll ever figure this out.
Yeah.
And so you just kind of like, geez. But the reality is, to take the next step in anything, I don't care what you're doing. The next step, you need courage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To take the next step, and then more courage. And the higher you get, kind of the more courage it takes,
definitely.
right? But then that's where encouragement comes along, and people who will either, lift you up a little bit and get you to the next step, or just tell you, hey, you've done this much work, you can do this again.
Yeah.
And I believe in you. And then they have the courage and they take the next step. And so there's a great value in encouraging through that time, but it's not easy as a parent.
Talk to me a little bit about on the teams that you manage, either at Rise or perhaps the high school level. What's a way that you help the team build a relationship? Some of what you're talking about to me is best within a close-knit group, right? Yeah. Where I'm going to have more courage if I know people have my back. I'm going to have more courage if I know we're in this together.
Yeah.
How do you enforce, and in the business world, on remote teams, I mean, there's another challenge there, but what's something that you try to do to build relationship?
Yeah. What we crave, I don't care who you are, and it's why people, young people especially, join a gang.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Is there, while that's dangerous, it may not be as dangerous as not being in a gang, right?
Sure.
There's safety in the team.
Sure.
And so that's our view is I want to be a part of something, but there's safety there. And who am I within that team? And so I think number one, you have to be creating an environment where safety is felt. If I screw this up, no one's chopping my head off. If you don't have that, you won't get any risk taking. You won't get any vulnerability. You won't get to know anybody.
Sure.
And so you might say, oh, this is a safe, but if those things don't exist and they can't be felt, you have no real chance of forming any true relationship.
Sure.
And so safety is a big part of. So what we even have done with our high school guys is, we have what we call Mindful Mondays now, and we've done versions of this over time, but we've been really good, I think, this year at trying to make it a bigger priority in a lot of ways. And part of what we ask our guys to do is, hey, everything that you guys say in here stays in here. So number one, there's safety in that, right?
Yeah.
But you have to hold your end of the bargain and say that this all stays here, but you also have to be really vulnerable.
Yeah.
So tell us why you struggle with this certain thing you struggle with, if you can. And what's amazing is when you have one or two or three, and especially those that might be perceived as leaders within that group, do that, it sort of starts a cascade, right, of vulnerability. And I think that connection, then it's like we've got this line going between us, but every time we are vulnerable, we wrap that line of communication in a net of safety, right, insulation, and it just becomes stronger.
Now, do you have to role model that at the very top and it cascades down, or do you hope you've got a natural leader who's willing to take that first step?
Yeah, role modeling it is obviously, the best form of that, I think. We currently at the high school at Warsaw here, we have a staff of guys that, man, I love those guys. Super high character, very team-oriented, hardworking, trustworthy, fun. And I hope that our players sense that, right? So I hope we're living that out in some ways. But we've also had lots of times where as a staff, we've cried with our guys, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is really hard. This thing happened off the court. And we talk about it. And we might even, be so moved by it that we cry. Not fake, it's real.
Yeah.
And so I think allowing our guys to see that and demonstrating that over time builds that trust and their willingness to be vulnerable. High school boys, 16, 17, 18-year-old boys, I mean, the last thing they want to do is let people in the door and let them see their warts.
Seems like a challenge.
But I think as you get older, you realize my best relationships have that aspect of like, a lot about me, man, and I've let you in and you didn't run away. I can trust you, right?
No, so I'm assuming that it's difficult at that level. You said, 16-year-old boy, they're going to draw this line and not necessarily want to let you in. Does it get easier or more difficult as you go up into collegiate sports and professional sports? And the reason I'm asking is because I think that's an issue a lot of leaders have in the workplace is getting in, not for the sake of being nosy, but getting in so that they can really support people working for them.
That's a great question. I can't speak for every organization. I suppose the leadership within that organization sets the tone in some ways of that. But I can tell you, and I guess I'd go as far as saying, even in professional basketball, the coaches who have been the most successful, they have the best players typically, right?
Sure.
But they also attract the best players, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just that they're able to get them; it's that the best players want to play for them. And why do they want to play for them? Well, they want to play for them because the coach is obviously interested in them.
Yeah.
And there's great power in that, Michael. The relationship piece of leadership, right, is somewhat obvious, but so hard. It's the hardest part to conquer. And, the Greg Popoviches of the world and the Steve Kerrs of the world or Tony Bennett at Virginia. And there are so many others that I'm, missing out, but or not naming, but those guys are masters at relationship.
Yeah.
And it creates an environment where it attracts then more people like that and creates safety, and it creates a bond that is so hard to break. You know this if you've listened to anybody talk about SEAL teams or special forces teams, right? Like those guys live together.
Yeah.
Right? And in some cases die together, right?
Right.
The guys will fly across the country to be with guys that they haven't seen in 40 years. And the brotherhood is so strong because of the experiences they had, what they shared while they were together, that it's unbreakable, almost more so than blood is, right? Brother to brother.
Yeah.
And that's what ultimately I think the best in sports and leadership do is they create those environments, and they do not hide from conflict. They do not hide from conflict. If there's something that needs to be addressed, they do it, I think, lovingly, kindly, humbly, and patiently.
Ryan, a lot of difficult situations in sports that I think have workplace equivalents, and one I really wanted to talk to you about today is accountability. So if I could give you, I'm notorious for bad analogies here, but you're at the end of the game, you're down by one, you're at the free throw line, and you bomb both shots. I mean, those are buckets that should be made, right? Player feels terrible. Some coaches would pull him aside and chew him out, right?
Probably.
Some may do that, depending on the level, obviously. What does accountability look like in those situations where to even mention it to the person, they're already beating themselves up?
Sure.
What does accountability look like maybe in a scenario like that?
Wow, yeah, that's the art of coaching, right?
Sure.
You do have the statistical side of coaching. You know, a guy who shoots 90% and then clanks 2 free throws would be pretty disappointing for everybody.
Sure.
Obviously, the player is more than anybody.
Yeah.
But the art of coaching is knowing, what to hold people accountable to.
Yeah.
And in the basketball world, missed shots, honestly, for us, even at the high school level, we don't talk about missed shots very much.
Yeah.
And I think there's a relationship here to business. We talk about process. We talk about things we can control. We know that there are acceptable losses, missed shots, right? We also know that, I think one of the things that the best leaders do in coaching, related to accountability in some ways, is their ability to unlock their players and their coaches. And by that, I mean, they figure out, okay, what is Michael really good at? And if we have a puzzle, where does Michael fit in that puzzle? So that Michael can do that thing he's really good at all the time. And I think those coaches who are able to kind of figure that, it's not what you can't do, it's what you can do. And how does that help us? Those coaches are able to really move the needle for their teams. Accountability is so tricky because accountability might look different from person to person in some ways, right?
Sure.
And we tend to lean on accountability more in the behaviors rather than outcome.
Okay.
So if, you're not coming to work, or you've missed 3 practices in a row because you're hanging out in the parking lot with your girlfriend after school.
Sure.
That's an accountability issue
Sure,
for us.
of course.
If you go 4 for 10 from the field and
Yeah.
you're normally a 65% field goal percentage, that's not necessarily accountability for
Sure.
us. So we have to really focus first on what's the relationship and how good and strong is that?
Yeah.
What can we say?
Right.
But also what in the end do we want out of this for them? And there are acceptable losses, and missed shots are going to happen regularly. There's also things that happen within a game, like this would be another example where, we say we're going to do something specifically at the end of the game. Maybe we're going to run a certain play and you're supposed to be in the left corner.
Sure.
Well, you run out and you stand in the right corner.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, now we've got an accountability issue,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Because you probably didn't listen.
Yeah.
Right? Which then caused the outcome to be different for our team. And now we got to hold you accountable in some way for that.
Yeah.
Probably not yelling at you, but here's what we'll probably do. You may not be in at the end of the quarter next time.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so that's accountability in a form, right?
Okay.
And so maybe lost opportunities in some ways. Doesn't mean you can't ever earn that back.
Sure. Sure.
But those are ways that we or how we would tend to view accountability more so than calling someone out. Behavior though, okay, hey, these are our pillars. These are the things we really lean on hard. They're very clear. And if you're outside of those, then we have to hold you to account for that just because it affects our culture.
Do you need perfect alignment in you and the assistants or other coaches on what to hold players accountable to, or is it subjective even at the various levels?
Yeah, I would say there needs to be some clarity, right? I mean, I think one thing that happens oftentimes is the players who are always doing it right, when they see someone who isn't and they get a pass, that can be very frustrating to everyone else. So there has to be clarity in what the things are that we're holding people accountable to. That doesn't mean every other player knows exactly what we're doing with this player or how we might be holding them accountable in other ways, right? So there are ways to kind of, I think, even work around that in a healthy way. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But.
It does. I mean, if you had an assistant that was holding that player accountable for missing the shot, but that's not your message or your methodology, you'd probably have a breakdown.
And I think part of that then, Michael, is, and I think as leaders we tend to do this, as people in general we tend to do this, instead of making something more clear, we make it more complex. So we tend to add things to make it better versus subtract things.
Red tape, process, too much process.
And obviously we know the fallout of doing all of that, right?
Yeah.
So as a coach, I'm always looking for ways to eliminate, right? Because you really can't focus on 25 different things.
Right.
It's going to be 3, 4, 5, depending on your group, that you can really focus on. Outside of that, it becomes hard to hold your coaches and your players to those things, right? So again, going back to those coaches I mentioned before, Popovich and Kerr, like those guys are also incredibly flexible. Right? So they realize it's not going to be perfect. And they will address that when it's appropriate. But I think for us, as a coaching staff, or my own personal view is that we have to tailor some of that to the individual, but also not overwhelm them with rules or certain accountabilities, right? Because I think that can become paralytic to their growth. So
we're talking a lot about basketball. I love basketball. I'm also a diehard football fan. Love the Eagles. We went 10-1, and in the last 7, 1-6. There was a lot of talk of our coach losing the locker room. What does that really mean? Can you break that down for our listeners? What does it mean? Because we hear it all the time, but I'm sure you've witnessed an equivalent at some point.
Well, if there's a breakdown in the locker room, you could have a few different things, right? You could have outside influences creeping in. You could have personal desires placed above the team desires, right? You could have, and I see this probably the most, is you have relationship damage. And by that I mean, oftentimes, because sports are emotional, right? And especially at the professional level, they're uber, intense, right? Millions and billions of dollars on the line, right? People's livelihoods, where they might live, all of those things are in play. And so for them, it's incredibly pressurized. They because of that, the emotions rise.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things, and I think we're seeing this in our culture in general, we've become really poor at managing our emotions, right? Because we think we have to have an opinion on absolutely everything.
Sure.
And that someone should hear our opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I liked it better, years ago when I didn't know everyone's opinion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just the people that I wanted to know.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're at a crisis in emotion. And sports are our place, where that really comes out. And it's partly why we love sports.
True.
Because it invokes in us this like intensity.
Excitement and
But it's also dangerous.
Yeah.
And so what often happens, and I see this, and I've been fortunate to be on some great teams with really great leadership, and I hope we're doing that, with what we're involved in currently as a coach and a coaching staff. But if you have an emotional outburst, or you're prone to emotional outbursts, you will quickly erode trust. You probably have in a season, let's say it's 5 or 6 months, you might have 2, maybe 3,
Yeah.
but you might have 2 instances that you can probably get on a group or someone really hard, and not a cruel way,
Sure.
but in an intense way, where they'll still respond to you.
Yeah.
But if that's your go-to,
Yeah.
and it is for a lot of coaches, Michael, it is.
I see it. I see it.
And if that's your go-to, you're going to have problems, because it's going to create wreckage. You're going to have to manage. You're going to have to manage then their own emotions, maybe in the high school setting, the parental emotions, the community emotions, the athletic leadership emotions, because everyone's going to have an opinion on what that looks like, because it's public.
Of course.
I'd probably say something relatively unpopular in the state of Indiana, and I don't mean to, disparage anyone, but the reality is, as I view it now, I grew up a child of the maybe very late 70s and 80s and in the 90s. And Indiana basketball, was the thing.
Hardcore.
Right? And I grew up watching the Hoosiers and Bobby Knight and all of that, right? And what I'm going to say is probably going to be controversial in some ways, but there probably wasn't anyone who had sort of in some ways caused more damage to Indiana high school basketball than Bobby Knight. And the reason I say that was because Bobby was volatile.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that's well documented, right? I don't know that Bobby treated everyone great all of the time. I do think he cared a lot.
Sure, sure.
I do think he was really good at his job of teaching the game of basketball. But I also think there was sort of a blueprint, maybe unintentionally, followed by so many high school coaches, where that sort of approach to coaching, right, where you rode kids hard and you just drove them to the ground and probably even belittled them, was the way to do it. And that just, it's, in my view now, as I look at it, no one wants to be treated that way. And I think what he was able to create was successful. In that he won some national championships. He won some Big Ten championships. But really, those are short term. Right? Like, those are short term gains. And so I worry that we're still kind of recovering from that in some way in the coaching world. And what people respond to the most is clarity, right? Okay, where are we going? Does my team understand what the vision is? Can I trust this guy or girl, this woman, to lead us there? And do they care about me? And if those things are in play, you've got a chance.
Oh, they'll run through brick walls for you.
I would. Right? I did. Without question. With some of the coaches I had. If those things weren't present, I'm hesitant.
So losing the locker room, you mentioned, it can be outside factors, can be the coach's approach is what I'm hearing you say here as well. How do you know that you're a young leader in the business world and you feel like you've lost the locker room? How do you know? What's happening?
Well, you probably feel isolated in some ways, right? The temperature in the room gets chilly. People probably aren't willing to speak up. Maybe your coaching staff is tiptoeing around you a little bit. Those kind of things, I think. Finger pointing, the blame game. Those things are all, and those things sort of actually become obvious well in advance of, you losing games. So I absolutely think those things will be present. I think the cure to those things is sort of that the response being, I'm humble enough to admit, man, I blew that. I did not treat this personal. And I'm not saying that happened in this situation exactly. I don't know the context of what's going on with the Eagles.
Sure.
But I do see this often, right?
Yeah.
And I think the thing that has a chance to mend that is a contrite apology, sincere, humble approach, and that I blew that. And I'm taking all the responsibility for it.
So you can lose a locker room and recover.
I believe so,
Okay.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally believe that's true. It's not easy.
Yeah, sure.
And that might mean that the makeup of the team changes eventually. Some guys will never forgive you for that.
Sure.
Right? And so it doesn't mean that it stays the same, but I do believe that those things that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, when those things are present in leadership, you have a chance to be successful, but you also have a chance of recovering from past failures.
You're given more grace in the long run, and especially when people understand the authenticity behind, you tried and you failed, and you're willing to learn and improve.
John Wooden, right? I mean, maybe one of the most recognized coaches of all time for good reason, right? All these national championships. But it's really his wisdom that people love and lean on even to this day. I mean, he's got some of the best-selling books in coaching and will always, because they're just full of wisdom. One of my favorite sayings that he often says or said was, there's nothing stronger than gentleness. And that sounds kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
But when you think about it, you think, okay, what does gentleness mean? It means, well, I'm thoughtful about what I'm about to say. I'm thoughtful about how you might take that. I'm considering your emotions in this, right? And so I'm not coming at you, strong-arming you. I'm being gentle in my approach with you. I want to understand. I want to learn. I want to grow. And I want to help you ultimately, right? And so there's nothing stronger than gentleness actually is the truth, because that is a higher form of leadership versus a reactionary form, which is very short-term.
If I'm a young leader and I misinterpret gentleness, I can easily misinterpret it as lack of accountability, right? Help listeners distinguish how you can be gentle but also hold people accountable, because I don't believe a lot of people get that balance right.
Yeah, I think probably back to clarity, right? So I think you see this in children when you're raising kids. One of the things that is probably the most damaging to your children is that when you say you're going to do this if they do that, and then you don't do what you said you were going to do, you're creating problems, right? And you're creating problems down the road.
You're lying.
And so that trust is eroded, right? And so they're going to probably push that envelope all the time, and you're going to come back with this, sort of heavy-handed, angry approach, and then emotions whip up, and there you are again.
Yeah.
And so I think the best thing that you can do for whether it's raising children in this way, when we're talking about accountability, or in a team setting, is let the natural consequences play out, right? So here's a great example. I feel like in some ways this was a terrible dad moment, but also a great dad moment. My daughter would oftentimes get into the car in the morning for school, and she was always rushing and she was late. And so a lot of times she'd get in the car and she wouldn't even have her shoes on yet. She's grabbing everything and she's running to the car, and I'm like, let's go. Well,
no other parent experiences that.
it was a daily thing, right?
Okay, yeah.
And I got to the point where I was like, I can't understand why we're doing this every day.
Yeah.
So what can I do about this? And I had just listened to a guy talk about natural consequences. You don't pack your lunch for school, guess what? You go hungry at lunch, right? And that's really hard as a parent to do.
Yeah.
Because I want my kids to be well-fed and focused and all of those things. She gets in the car, doesn't have her shoes on. I don't even recognize that she doesn't even have shoes. She left them. She just, in the midst of grabbing everything else, she forgot her shoes. We get to the school drop-off line, which is like the worst place in the world, right? If you're in any kind of rush at all.
Yeah.
Because no one else is rushing.
No one.
And she's about to get out of the car, and she's like, Dad, I don't have my shoes. And she starts to freak out.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I'm like, okay, this is sort of a watershed moment for her, us.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm like, babe, I'm sorry. You have to get out of the car.
Yeah.
And she just didn't want to do it, of course.
Sure.
And I stayed in the line, and I was really tempted, Michael, to drive home.
Yep.
Get her shoes, bring her back, sign her in a little bit late.
Sure.
We stayed in line and she starts to cry. And it was the hardest thing as a dad to sit there, watch her just, I don't want it. And she's tearing up and crying. And I made her get out of the car and go in the building with no shoes on.
Yeah.
And that may have been one of the very best things I ever did for her.
Yeah.
Far more organized now, far more thoughtful about her,
Sure.
what she needs to bring and do. And that really was a natural consequence.
Yeah.
But I had to hold to that, and that was really hard. So as a leader, create clarity in here are the consequences for some things here. And when those things happen, you can say, sorry, but I'm holding you to this.
Yeah.
And you kind of chose it knowing this was the outcome, and this is just the way it's going to be. And that's really hard.
Well, that's a great example, Ryan, because I do think you check the box of accountability and gentleness. I mean, it's easy to want to protect your daughter from getting questions about her shoes, but the reality was that little bit of discomfort and, I mean, long-term benefits from that situation.
Yeah. And it did cross my mind, what's their teacher going to think? The Brickers are sending their kids to school without shoes, right?
Sure.
I'm like, man, I don't really care what the teacher thinks about this because this is a long-term play.
Yeah.
And so, that was an example, but there are so many opportunities, I think, when you're working with people and leadership. I think clarity in what the mission is, clarity in what accountability is and how we will do that helps people. I go back to even like, I had a yellow lab. And when I put that shock collar on her, right, and she stepped across the boundary when she was a puppy and it got her. Yeah. Right. She went and lived on the porch for 2 days.
Sure.
She's just like, what happened, right? And wouldn't even, but eventually she figured out where the boundaries were.
Sure.
And she lived very happily for 13 years within those boundaries.
Yeah.
And while that was painful and I didn't enjoy it and she certainly didn't, we got through it. She grew up and she knew this is safe here. And that's ultimately, I think, our job as leaders. Yeah.
You mentioned Bob Knight. Not a huge fan. I know you said it's controversial, but I know a couple real Bob Knights in the workplace. And a question that I've always asked, and in this Bob Knight situation, I'd had the same question: is who modeled that to them? You know, and where did they come from? Have you seen a coach totally shift from that Bob Knight mentality to this approach you're talking about of holding people accountable in a gentle way?
Yeah.
Have you seen coaches?
I have. Yeah, and I can think of 2 or 3 off the top of my head where I've seen 15, 20 years ago the way they were compared to the way they are now. Absolutely seen that. And I don't know where those things are always modeled for everybody. And I don't, I've not gone into a real deep dive of Bob Knight's young life necessarily or remember that exactly, but I know there's a military background there and all of that, right? And listen, military life in some ways is very different, right? Sure. Like, hey, I am going to scream at you right now because you're about to get us all killed.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
And so that's a short term.
Stakes are slightly higher.
Yes.
Yeah.
But even then, they have to grow in those ways. But so that could have been part of it. And that was just I think a cultural thing at the time. It was just more that way. The way that people led oftentimes was that way. The unique thing about Bob was, while maybe his players didn't love it, everyone else did. And here's why: is because it was unpredictable. It made for good TV.
Oh, definitely.
Right? Throw a chair across the floor.
Exciting.
Have a crazy outburst in a press conference. Like, that's good TV.
Yeah.
The reality is, for the people you're leading, it's a terrible way to live.
Terrible.
Because it is unpredictable. I don't know what to expect. I don't know where we're going. I don't know what's going to happen to me. And so I just go like this all the time and don't stick my neck out, and honestly, probably don't grow that much as a result. So, well,
think about your electric fence example with your dog. Imagine moving the boundaries of that electric fence all the time. I mean, that's what's unfair.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, great point.
Ryan, if I'm a new leader in the workplace and I'm fighting against, I just want to be liked, and I'm fighting against this as a coach, right? Hey, I want the kids to like me. Sure, there's some natural tendencies there, but how do you coach somebody out of that being primary focus? Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be liked by everybody.
Right. Wow, that's a great question. There's an innate desire to be, but probably I wouldn't even say liked as much. I mean, for men especially, it's probably to be respected.
Respected, sure.
Right? Liked is nice,
Yeah.
but respected is better.
Sure.
Right. And
Sure.
you see that at least in the coaching world, that's sort of what you see in guys. I want to be respected. And so guys go about that in a lot of different ways.
Sure.
Some of them very unhealthy. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how you teach someone to not be so consumed by that.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways comes back to identity, right? Who am I in this? What am I? You have some people in your family, cousins especially, that I know that are very good leaders, the Tonigal family, and various, platforms.
Yeah.
And one thing that stands out to me about them, all of them have been successful in their own way and pretty significant roles in their jobs, but also in their families. I think they do a good job. They would admit that it's not perfect all the time.
Of course.
But I would say they are all very disciplined and hungry to learn.
Yeah.
And also they know that they don't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so their desire to learn and be humble is so incredible to me, and that's a credit to their family, their mom and dad, Hugh and Kathy. But I think when you're talking about leadership as a young age, I hope that you can find, or as you're searching for leadership, what you're really looking for is someone who's humble and someone who's probably wise.
Mm-hmm.
They may not have to know everything about the industry at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
But do they have some noticeable wisdom at a young age,
Yeah.
right? And are they humble and hungry to learn?
Definitely.
And if those things are in play, you've got a chance, even as a young coach or leader, to be successful. Now, you're going to have to put people around you, and you're going to have to be encouraged, and you're going to want to quit probably
all the time.
every year at some point, right?
Yeah.
But if you're wise
Yeah.
and you're seeking wisdom, some people, it might come a little naturally too, but those who seek wisdom, not knowledge, wisdom,
Sure.
and those that are humble, they've got a chance to affect people's lives very positively and grow in their leadership. Without that, I just don't know how you can shift someone suddenly into that, right? And I think those older leaders who have maybe struggled, maybe early were very, authoritarian and heavy-handed. You stack up enough experiences where you're like, dude, this just doesn't work.
Yeah.
I face the same battles every year, oftentimes with the same people. Maybe the problem is me, right? And those guys who have shifted were humble enough to go, it was probably me.
On an earlier podcast, we talked about 3 key attributes: humble, hungry, and smart, from the Lencioni books, which you just touched on there perfectly. Ryan, one of the hardest things in the workplace is not everybody can be everything, right? I think maybe an analogy would be not every player on your team is suited for captain. Doesn't mean that they're not great contributors, doesn't mean that they're not totally valued members of the team, but captain is a specific designation, right?
Yeah.
And do you usually see people kind of self-nominate their own captain, or how does that process work?
Yeah, really. That's I've heard this done different ways, right?
Okay.
Sometimes it is the coaching staff saying, hey, this is the guy we need to lead in this way, right?
Okay.
And they're appointed in some ways. Sometimes it's a vote among the players.
Okay.
Problem with that version of it is it can become a popularity contest,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And that's not what you want. So at the high school level, we probably say, hey, if we're going to have a captain, we're going to probably pick that
Okay.
a little more often than we're just going to let them nominate, because we don't want a popularity contest.
Sure.
But what we find is most of the time we get that right.
Okay.
There might be some instances where we don't, and we've had instances where we don't, for sure. You want to give it to the older, more experienced guys, right? But I think what we've learned is, again, who do we trust here? Who do we see as wise?
Yeah.
Right? And who has a more likely ability to lead this group down the road, and let's let them grow in that. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And in the workplace, what I've come to learn is, if you pick the wrong captain, the right one will ultimately surface at a point in time.
Michael, I mean, part of being a barber for 20 years was I got, if I can say it this way, a master's in people.
Oh, definitely.
Right? Definitely. I mean, I was able to see themes in people's lives play out over the course of time decisions they make, implications of that over 15 or 20 years.
Sure.
There are people in this community who work in businesses that have millions and millions of dollars of productivity and capital and whatever, who would be awesome leaders in those businesses.
Sure.
And in some ways they are leading, but maybe they're not the leader or the few leaders, right?
Sure.
And the reason for them a lot of times is they don't want that. Because they want other areas of their lives to be important,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And so oftentimes leadership, I think, unfortunately, is granted to, in some cases, those that just really want it badly.
Yeah, of course.
And boy, if your board is, filled with people like that who are like, I know a guy who could do this job, right? And he's really not a great character, but he just really wants it badly. And your buddies.
Yeah, that's a problem. Goes back to identity too, big time.
So there's lots of great examples of men and women in this community who I know could lead multi-million, billion-dollar companies.
Yeah.
But the reality is they have a safe identity in who they are, and they don't feel the need for that. And not that that's wrong to want to do that.
No, sure.
And there's some people who are doing that wonderfully, even with in big environments, but doing it very humbly. And kudos to them because that's hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a lot of people who are like, you know what? I'm thankful for what I have, and I want these other areas of my life to be important as well.
No, it makes total sense. Ryan, if let's say a newer parent is really evaluating getting their kids into sports, or maybe, hey, they've gone through T-ball, or that's kind of step one. What would you tell them? Hey, this is the benefit. Here's what can happen if this works really well. What are some of those things that you really see?
Yeah, one of the main benefits of athletics I see at any level is adversity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You go to the weight room to lift to make your muscles hurt so your muscles will grow. You play athletics because bad things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's going to prepare you for bad things that happen later in life.
Yeah.
And so I would say to any parent who's got children at home who might be athletic minded or want to pursue athletics, to dabble in a lot of different versions of sport.
Sure.
But I would say welcome adversity, plan for it, figure out ahead of time how you're going to navigate it. Have a plan for what, the consequences will be when, Johnny, kicks his teammate in the shins,
sure.
Or gives his coach the side eye because he's angry at him, right?
Or doesn't want to go to practice.
Yes, or doesn't want to go to practice, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you take him anyway. And man, that is what you're signing up for. I tell a lot of our parents, when I have the opportunity anyway, to speak to parents, here's what you're signing. You think you're signing up for your name in the paper. You think you're signing up for championships. You think you're signing up for glory in your family and friends at work.
Yeah.
Here's what you're really signing up for. You're signing up for hard.
It's going to be a hard time.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And in some places, it's harder than others.
Yeah.
In this community, in certain sports, it's harder than others because it's public. It's very well attended. And that's not easy. And so if your identity is not in a good place, you are going to struggle.
Yeah.
And probably your kid's going to struggle as a result because you as the parent are not rooted properly in what your identity should be. And so you can't give that to them.
Yeah.
And I would advise parents to absolutely participate in athletics 100%. I think it's a great thing. Also, I think music's great. I think there's lots of avenues for growth and learning. I still can't play the piano, and I've tried a lot, right? It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
So signing up for athletics is hard. Embrace that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Embrace it.
What do you see in the students, in the kids that are really good leaders, and maybe they get that captain designation, or this is kind of like their first step into leadership in many cases, right?
Yeah.
What are the attributes that they're demonstrating consistently?
Yeah. Awareness of the people around them, right?
Emotional intelligence.
EQ, right?
Okay.
I'm thinking of a couple guys on our team right now who maybe don't play a ton, but I would say, this kid's a leader for us, right? Because he's in tune with the people around him.
Yeah.
And they know that if they got in a fight, that he would be there.
Yeah.
For them. And so I think that's a thing, the ability to feel what's happening around you with others, right? I think that's a primary thing. I think another thing would be, what are your habits? Are you the guy who's here early, staying later, serving, right? Are you the guy that gets off the bus and just walks into the locker room? Are you the guy who gets off the bus and goes and grabs the water cooler and the ball bag and carries it in, even though you're a senior and probably the freshman should be doing that, right? Sure. Those guys who serve, and that's humble, right? Yeah. But you're aware of what's happening around you, you're humble, and you are about this group, you're about what we can do, and you demonstrate that consistently. Man, I pray that those are the kids that we would be raising in our families, like those kids, and the golden retriever type, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Who loves you fiercely, but will chase that ball until you tell me to stop.
Yeah.
Those are the kids that are going to be great leaders in sports.
That's great. Ryan, 2 more quick topics here. First one I wanted to ask you about is, how do you prioritize in your role winning versus personal development? And I don't mean to imply that they're mutually exclusive. And in fact, they're probably very correlated. But how do you, where do you focus? How do you focus? How do you split that up?
Yeah, focusing on outcomes, I think I've learned now is, as I view it now, and again, if you had asked me 15 years ago, do you know a lot about coaching and basketball? I would have been like, yeah. Man, I've learned so much in the last 15 years of coaching. Yeah. I've learned this. If we talk about winning, it's probably the wrong thing to talk about, right?
Sure.
To focus on outcomes, I just have learned and now believe that is the wrong viewpoint. It is, you have no chance of having consistent outcomes if you're not process driven in some ways, right? So figuring out what wins, right, ultimately, and focusing on those things probably most of the time will produce winning. And then when you celebrate that temporarily, and then it's a vapor, it's gone, and you've got to go back to the process again. Yeah. So you live in the process so much more than you live in the moment of winning. And those people who are able to live in the process, because here's what the process is. It's usually alone or in the dark.
Sure.
And painful.
Yeah.
And cost you something. The people who are willing to live in the mundane of that, those are the people who, when it's all said and done, have racked up the wins. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So we really try hard to not speak a lot about winning, because if you focus on that and it looks like it's not going to happen, fear creeps in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
If you look at the process, okay, we still have time to improve this. We still have 2 more days to get this right. Yeah. Versus, oh my goodness, right? This isn't going to happen. We've got a chance still. And then those that can live in that, I just think there's, without a question, they're going to rack up more W's in the end. And the reality is, then you look at the W's and you're like, yeah, those are nice, but I really enjoyed the process more. Right? I enjoyed when it hurt so bad and my buddy behind me was encouraging me. Man, that filled me up. That was the good stuff. The W, it lasted 10 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you coach your team on getting over losses quickly and also getting over wins quickly as well?
Yeah, and that's easier to do as you get older in some ways, I think, when you're young and you're fiery. And those competitive juices are just really burning hard, and they always burn to some degree, but and you're not maybe as emotionally controlled. Yeah, you let those things really rattle you sometimes, right? Yeah. And that's unfortunate, and I think that's an area of growth for sure. So yes, not to belabor the point, but you're back to the mundane and trying to, let's say we walk in the locker room, Michael, and we just lost a big game. And that's happened this year twice already. Yeah. We've had some big wins. Yeah. But we've gone in, and if you had taken both of those scenarios, they would look different in the locker room. Yeah. A little more celebratory, body language is a little better when we win, right? Sure. A little more attentive. But the message I think we're giving them is essentially the same thing, no matter whether we've won or lost, right? Sure. And so again, I think that gives our guys clarity about the long-term mission. Don't forget about the long term.
Yep.
I think it keeps it consistent in what we care about, and that gives them safety. Okay, they don't hate us right now.
Yeah.
Maybe they're disappointed, but they don't hate us, and we'll be back tomorrow. And there's safety in that. And so, I 100% try to keep the message consistent, win or lose. Do not ride the wave of emotion of wins and losses as much as possible, which is really hard, especially when you're in the leadership role, because you feel like it all falls back on me.
Oh, definitely. Every client complaint or every new sale or but again, it comes back to identity, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. I mean, I think that long-term view, I can go back to my own high school days, and if it weren't for, the record books and some video, I'd be like, what happened in that game, Because you just forget.
Yeah.
It is the lessons ultimately. So knowing that you're jumping into something that you're going to win and lose in, you're going to be disappointed in, you're going to celebrate in, and accepting that as part of the whole thing makes it tolerable. If you're just so hyper-focused on winning or losing, and you lose, then you become emotional. When you become emotional, you damage your relationships. When you damage your relationships, it's harder to get outcomes that you want because you're not focusing on the process anymore. You're focusing on the outcome. And so it just cascades into something that falls apart. And so avoid spending too much time on that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And Ryan, I think you've answered this question brilliantly in the past couple of minutes here, but I read a really interesting study. A bunch of organizations submitted a profile on their top performers. Mm-hmm. And then, a company dug into these results to find out, what do they all have in common, right? Is it level of education? Is it upbringing? What is it? And they actually found the common denominator was they were collegiate athletes. Mm-hmm. That was the most common denominator here. Does that surprise you at all?
No. Here, I tell people, parents even, right, and players, because everyone has this dream in their mind, Michael. I want to, not everyone, many. I want to play in college.
Sure.
Right? Sure. This sounds so nice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the reality is college athletics is really, really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
And I don't think people, because what they see is the IU Purdue game.
Sure.
Right? And there's 18,000 people there, and it's a sellout, and it's just all of this hype, and it looks like so much fun, and I want to be a part of that. But that's a fraction. Yeah. Like the smallest fraction of the time that they have. Do you want to be on campus, away from your family, all of June and July at IU or Purdue, like slugging it out again with your guys and doing these incredible workouts that are just going to kill you?
Yeah.
Like, if you don't love that, you won't make it.
It's going to be hard.
Now, that's IU Purdue. I'm going to tell you that it's not that much different in the Crossroads League,
Sure.
A local collegiate league that we have here. Those guys work their tails off. Yeah. Those coaches work their tails off. It is hard.
Yeah.
And so those that are able to go through that do gain incredible amounts of grit, I think.
Yeah.
They do develop their leadership. They do learn a lot. They do realize, man, I survived a really hard thing. I guess I can survive this now too. And you have a whole nother group of people in your corner, hopefully if it went well for you, that those relationships are probably going to endure maybe even more than your high school relationships will, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I have some really great high school friends, but the majority of my friends to this day are my collegiate friends. Why? Because I lived with them.
Yeah.
I lived with them. And what we did was really, really hard. And so it does not surprise me to hear that.
Yeah.
There's so many overlapping things that collegiate athletics offers to a individual that prepares them incredibly well for being a part of a team like yours.
Yeah.
And man, that is so important. If it's a option for you and you're willing to gut it out, I say go for it.
Yeah.
But don't expect it to be easy and fun.
Yeah.
It will be hard, but in the end, you'll look back like I do, very grateful. As hard as it was.
Yeah.
Man, did I learn a ton. And my life never changed more from when I was 18 to 22.
Sure.
Changed a lot. My environment completely changed. My friends completely changed.
Yeah.
My study habits had to evolve. What I learned about myself living on my own in a lot of ways, completely different than living with my parents for 18 years.
Sure.
So the amount of growth that
yeah.
you have, and the safety nets in some ways being removed from you at that time.
And the competition ramping up. Not only safety nets removed, but now you're competing.
Another level. Every year. And not to mention the guys on your team, while you're brotherly with them in some ways, they also want to play more than you.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not just you got to beat this team. You've got to actually, in some ways, compete against your brothers too. Yeah. And iron sharpens iron.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? And that's good. And we can all, it's not a zero-sum game. We can all elevate, right? And our team can be stronger as a result. But that is a reality, is there's competition within the team too in some ways, in those environments especially. So so many good lessons learned. It does not surprise me.
Ryan, why don't you finish this up here with just if a parent wants to learn more about Rise, what can they do to get some more information?
Yeah, you can go to our website, risewarsaw.com. That's the probably best way to get a feel for, kind of what we're about, and you can kind of peruse the things that we do there. Basketball has kind of become the thing that we do. We used to do a lot of different sports,
sure.
Whether that was soccer or flag football, but now we've really just kind of honed in on basketball, partly because it's a real passion of mine.
Sure.
And it's kept me very busy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just with that alone. And so, during the season, the high school basketball season, I don't do as much with it because all the kids are in a team sport at that point.
Okay. Sure.
But when we get to the spring, and then through the summer and the early fall, I do a ton with that. And whether that's individual training, small group training, 3-on-3 leagues, we kind of do all of those things. But it's been, I hope, a valuable thing for the community, for the kids. Certainly made a great connection for me to them, and families. And honestly, probably to some degree, a surprise to me a little bit is how much time I spend talking to parents. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by that, but I think the parents, they need resources too, and they need encouragement, and they need some clarity on, okay, how does this really work, and what should I be thinking about? And you have the parents who all they care about is their kids' training, but you also have the parents who are like, hey, I'm struggling with how to understand how to navigate all this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they need encouragement there, and we do that too. So
that's great.
I'm really thankful for the opportunity to do it.
Well, thanks for everything you do for the community and investing in sports and kids and the parents, of course, and appreciate everything you do. And thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It was great.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.